Thanks everyone for having me. Uh, Let me start with two confessions. One is because this topic is about how we generate alpha. The focus is on positive stories, what has worked for us, and the lessons we've learned from that. Uh, but obviously, it's by no means proportionate to what happens in our actual portfolio. We have our more than fair share of losers as well. So the spirit is just to learn from what has worked. The second is that uh, I have a slightly partial understanding of the topic because if you see that phrase, generating alpha in uncertain time. So I've been a stock investor since my college days, so the generating alpha is fine. But I'm a bit uncertain about uncertain times. How do you measure uncertain times? Is the uncertainty today more than what it was 5 years back? So there is obviously a lot of news, and I think with WhatsApp and Twitter and Facebook and all kinds of digital stuff, we're being exposed to a lot of information. But one way to measure uncertainty, at least in the markets, is what we call the implied volatility, or VIX. And this is a chart of VIX across all the four big asset markets, in the sense equities, bonds, currencies, and commodities. If you look at this chart, then obviously, while we are not in a very pleasant time, but neither are we in a very bad time. So we seem to be in a very middling time. So I guess the uncertainty comes with hindsight. 2007 was looking very uncertain till 2008 happened. So one is that. So moving on, what I've tried to do to address the generating alpha side is basically to look at 5 kind of concepts which have helped us in the last 5 years as a fund house, and hopefully derive some everlasting lessons from them. So the first concept is margin of safety. Now, as stock pickers, a lot of people ask us, are you a value stock picker? Are you a growth stock picker? Do you buy concept stocks? When is a stock worth buying? And personally, one framework which has helped me is when you pick a stock, and this is very aspirational. You don't get such bargains very easily. But just try to see if the stock price you're buying today can become the EPS of the stock. Obviously, this will not happen in 2-3 years. It could happen in 5 to 10 years or more than that. But where it helps me is to just bridge the styles of investing, whether it's a value stock, whether it's a growth stock, whether it's a concept stock. The logic is very simple, that if you buy a stock whose price becomes the EPS and no stock trades at 1, you obviously are in the money. So I'll just pick out 2 stocks where we've come close, honestly, over the last 3-4 years. As I said, it's a very aspirational target to pick stocks like these. But I just wanted to give a flavor of both value and growth stocks which have kind of come close. So one was TNPL, which in our PMS in 2011, we used to own, buying it around 75-80 bucks. So if you see today, the EPS is roughly 40, which means that you're almost there. There's only kind of 2p on what you bought about 4-5 years back. So this was a typical value stock, cheap on price to book, good dividend yield, very competitive position in the paper industry. The other stock is a growth stock. Again, we bought the stock in 2010 for a price of almost 65-70. And you can see the EPS then was 3.5, but today the EPS is 21. So again, we are getting close where the EPS today is kind of reaching the price we paid for almost 4 to 5 years back. So I found this framework to be quite useful in terms of buying stocks for the long term with a good margin of safety. The second lesson goes back to my experience from the last big cycle of 2003 to 2007. So what happens in a big bull market is that a lot of people think most companies will keep growing, but there are certain impediments to a lot of companies' growth, whether it's scalability of the business model, the management capability, the industry size. So I think especially even today when for last 4-5 years mid-caps have done well, you need to exercise a bit of caution because there are very few companies which over 10-15 years will deliver 15-20% CAGR. Maybe out of 100 there will be 2-3 companies. But in a bull market the tendency is to say that most companies will do that. So I'm not going to name the company, but this is a company I used to personally own around 2003 to 6 period. And you can see that some of these small companies, they have a very good 3-4 years, the EPS multiplies over 4 years, the EPS becomes 3 or 4 times. But when I look back, I don't hold the stock right now, but when I look back today at what the company has done over 10-12 years, today the EPS is broadly where it was about 10 years back. So the point I'm making is, in today's world, it's very difficult to do buy and hold very passively. You have to keep monitoring the business model of companies, the competitive intensity of that industry, etc. So don't be overtly passive about what you bought. Third is obviously when we buy, especially in the growth stocks with a buy and hold approach, it's obviously very important to get a good management. And one aspect I think which doesn't get too much attention is when you look at a management, try to think who's doing strategy and who's doing execution. So Warren Buffett also made this point that a lot of times when a person internally from the company is promoted to CEO, it is the equivalent of teaching a guy piano for many years and asking him to perform in a concert. And when he reaches the concert, you give him a violin to play. Because the guy who's grown through the company essentially excels at execution. But when he has to become the CEO and perform a good job there, the core expertise is as much capital allocation as much as execution is. In fact, you could say capital allocation is a bigger responsibility than execution. But the people who've been promoted internally haven't been trained in capital allocation. So, couple of companies which have worked well for us on a very long-term basis, we've been holding these stocks for almost 5-6 years now. What I realized what was common to these stocks, which is Motherson and Bajaj Finserv, is that there is a promoter and there is a CEO or someone who is executing. So there is a kind of segregation of roles and there is enough bandwidth on both sides. There is the CEO, let's say Sanjeev Bajaj or Chand Sehgal, who basically focuses on the big stuff, M&A, capital allocation, etc. And then you have a set of CEOs or COOs who basically go and execute that strategy. If you have a management which is very good in one but not very good in another, I think then you have to be careful about owning the stock from a buy and hold perspective. Also, and I think this works for any style of investing, for any mutual fund, your personal portfolio, etc. Basically focus on some big ideas, because if you obviously diversify your bets too much, you're not likely to either beat the market or generate supernormal return. So when I look back at our house, what we got right largely I could just put in 4 points what we did well over last 4 years. So in 2000 first half, because the current account deficit was 6%, you moved into dollar plays like ID Pharma. In 2014, mid caps became cheap, you bought that. 2015, you realized that the dollar was becoming stronger, yuan was likely to depreciate, and you kind of moved away from cyclicals. 2016 Feb, because of valuation, you moved back into cyclical. So obviously on hindsight, this is very, very easy, but the point I'm making is ultimately a lot of investing boils down to critical turn points, and your focus has to be very sharp at that point of time. If you miss those points, it's very difficult to create alpha otherwise. And finally, as Ed Klarman says, basically when you look at value investing, largely we are a value house with a contrarian approach. It is basically about a mix of psychology and economics. You need to have both. You can't just work purely on psychology or economics. So if you look at some of the stocks we bought from a contrarian perspective, 2 of them, for example, have worked. Hindustan Zinc and HPCL have multiplied. But something like Wipro hasn't worked for us. We've been holding the stock for 3 years. So here the important point is what doesn't work. You have to be careful it doesn't knock you out, in the sense that your weightage on stocks has to also be a function of financial and operating leverage of that company. With a company which has a good balance sheet and decent cash flow, even if you go wrong, you will not lose absolute capital. But if you want to put a bet on a company which has extreme financial and operating leverage, your bet has to be very small. So that is one lesson which we focused on a lot. So with that, I'll end my presentation and open the floor for questions.